In this video, we're going to have a look at how the assumptions of the psychodynamic approach can explain a variety of behaviours. There are three main assumptions of the psychodynamic approach. They are conflicts in the unconscious mind, the tripartite personality, and influence of childhood experiences. That's talking about the psychosexual stages. We're going to look at how those three assumptions can explain the behaviours of criminal behaviour, phobias, and schizophrenia. If you were going to have an exam question about using the assumptions to describe behaviours, one of the first things you'd need to do is explain what the behaviour is you're going to discuss, and secondly, which assumption you are going to use to explain that behaviour. And then you need to give plenty of examples. So the first behaviour we're going to explain is criminal behaviour. And we're going to use the assumption of the abnormal development of the tripartite personality to explain criminal behaviour. Now, we know that the tripartite personality explains that the personality is made up of three parts: the id, which is driven by the pleasure principle, the ego, which works on the reality principle, and the superego, which works on the morality principle. If we say that criminal behaviour is acting in an immoral way, acting against morals, then hopefully we can see quite immediately which part of the personality that perhaps is linked to criminal behaviour, and that would be the superego. So there's something abnormal about the superego that perhaps causes criminal behaviour. So we know that the superego develops around the age of 5, and it develops in the process of resolution of the Oedipus complex during the phallic stage. So that's where, to resolve the Oedipus complex, the child identifies with their same-sex parent, takes on board the qualities of their same-sex parent, and part of that process is internalising the moral values of the same-sex parent. So the superego could, however, develop abnormally in three ways during that process, which may cause criminal behaviour. The first way it may be abnormal is it may be a weak superego. Now, this might happen if the same-sex parent is absent during the phallic stage, absent during that resolution of the Oedipus complex. So the child cannot take on board those moral values because they're not there to take them from, to watch and share them from. So that's the first one, a weak superego. They don't develop their superego properly because the same-sex parent wasn't there for them to internalise their moral values. The second possible problem with the superego could be a deviant superego. In this explanation, the same-sex parent is there for them to identify with and internalise the moral values from, but this time the moral values of that same-sex parent are themselves deviant or wrong. So perhaps the same-sex parent is a criminal themselves, or they certainly don't see anything wrong with certain kind of criminal behaviours, perhaps things other people would say were wrong or immoral. So when the child identifies with the parent and takes on those morals, the morals they take on are deviant in the first place. So as an adult, they may act criminally because their superego doesn't tell them not to. Their superego doesn't think those things are wrong. Okay, it's a deviant superego. And the third way the superego could develop abnormally is if it's an overly harsh superego. So this might happen if during that phallic stage, during that identification with that same-sex parent, that the parent is overly moralistic, takes too much interest in behaving in a perfect way, doing exactly what's right. And so when the child develops those morals, they are also overly moralistic. So their superego develops to be overly harsh and critical. So every time the person does anything, every time the person does anything to satisfy the id, the superego is really critical and makes them feel very full of anxiety and full of guilt. That excessively powerful superego makes them feel guilty much of the time. So this could result in criminal behaviour because the person wants to get caught and they want to get punished because then they feel better to satisfy the guilt of the superego. They feel they need to be punished because the superego makes them feel guilty most of the time. So that's explaining criminal behaviour, the abnormal development of the superego in one of those ways. The next behaviour we're going to have a look at are phobias. And we're going to try and explain phobias as due to conflicts in the unconscious mind. So this explanation would say that phobias are the result of unresolved conflicts between the id, the ego, and the superego. And actually what happens is the ego has to employ defense mechanisms to deal with the anxiety. So these conflicts between the id and the ego, they're too strong, too difficult, causing anxiety, and the ego has to employ defense mechanisms. So just to be clear what a phobia is an overwhelming and unreasonable fear of an object or a situation that in reality aren't threatening, aren't dangerous. So it's okay to be scared of a shark if you're right there in the water with it and it's about to eat you. That's not a phobia, that's completely rational. A phobia is when you are very, very, very fearful of something that actually doesn't harm you. So for example, you could be phobic of spiders. In this country, spiders not going to hurt you, so it's an irrational fear. So that's a phobia. So Freud would say that these phobias arise because of a conflict in childhood that caused so much anxiety that the ego could not cope and had to employ the defense mechanism of displacement. And so that anxiety was displaced, put on the object you are now fearful of, the object you now have a phobia of. So in other words, it's not actually the fear object, so in this case spiders, that actually is what you're really anxious about. It's something else that you've put onto that object. It's something, a previous conflict that you've had, that you've displaced onto that object. So in that case, the only way you can cure a phobia is to work out what the initial conflict was, what the initial anxiety was, and resolve that and work that out, and then the phobia should go away. So Freud developed this theory. His evidence came from a case study of a boy called Little Hans. And this is a very famous case study. And it's well worth reading up and finding out a bit more about this case study. But it's all about Little Hans, and it's this 5-year-old boy. And he had an intense phobia of horses, and in particular of white horses, and of them biting him, and of them particularly of horses with a black muzzle and blinkers on. Freud said then that the reason Little Hans was phobic of these horses was because he was going through the Oedipus complex. And during that Oedipus complex, you are fearful, or the boy is fearful of his father, and in particular he's fearful of castration by his father. He has castration anxiety. So Freud suggests that actually it was this fear of the father and castration anxiety was what he was really anxious about, and he displaced that onto horses. Okay, so horses were that representation of that anxiety. And in this case, they were horses because the horse represented the father, and the father used to wear glasses and used to have a moustache, which links into the blinkers and the black muzzle of the horses. Okay. So Hans was only able to overcome his phobia when he realised, when he resolved his Oedipus complex, and when he identified with his father and moved through that stage of the phallic stage, through the Oedipus complex. So it's suggesting that phobias are actually, we're not really afraid of the thing we think we're afraid of. It's some sort of anxiety, some sort of ego defense mechanism has made you displace that anxiety onto that particular object. Okay, our third behaviour we're going to have a look at is schizophrenia. Now, you will learn a lot about schizophrenia in the second year of the course, and you will talk about explaining schizophrenia from a psychodynamic perspective, from the psychodynamic approach. So this is just a bit of an introduction here. You will learn about this more later. So we're going to try and explain schizophrenia in terms of the influence of childhood experiences. So just to briefly give you an idea of what schizophrenia is, there are a variety of different symptoms people have with schizophrenia, but the main one is a lack of contact with reality. Okay, it's the main characteristic. In schizophrenia, you have a lack of contact with reality. So the psychodynamic approach says that it's the ego that works on the reality principle. So that suggests that some sort of problem in childhood during the development of the ego could be linked to schizophrenia. Something that's preventing the ego from functioning properly could be an explanation for schizophrenia. So Freud said that people with schizophrenia were fixated at the oral stage of development. And during the first bit of the oral stage of development, the first few months of life. And it's possible that this ego developed due to a cold and uncaring mother, and this is called the schizoid mother, but you'll look at more about that next year, but perhaps it's something to do with the mother, a rejecting mother. So when these people are adults, if they have lots of stress, excessive stress and anxiety, what they might do is, rather than try and deal with that in a normal way, people might, if they have, they might chew gum or they might smoke if they've got kind of an oral kind of personality, an oral fixation. Rather than doing that, actually what they do is they regress back to the oral stage. And they're regressing back to the oral stage when the ego wasn't really very well developed. If you remember, the ego doesn't develop until you're about 2. So the ego hasn't really developed. So if the ego hasn't really developed, then they don't have any concept of reality. It's just the id in control. So there's nothing to stop the id from acting just however it wants, unimpeded. So those symptoms of schizophrenia, like hallucinations and delusions, what they are really is the id just behaving unchecked by the ego, because the ego hasn't developed properly, it's not there. So people with schizophrenia find it really hard to distinguish between reality and their desires and their fantasies, which we're explaining by saying the ego isn't in control of the id. This is kind of like how you are as a newborn when you just do what you want to do, and your behaviour is characterised by what we call primary narcissism. It's all about survival and instincts and looking out for yourself. So we're suggesting that schizophrenia perhaps is something to do with the poor development of the ego, something to do with the oral stage of development, and people who are experiencing great stress are regressing back to that oral stage. The ego isn't fully in charge. You aren't able to see things from a reality perspective, and the id is in control.